Inside the Supreme Court, live on national television, Jasmine Crockett and Chief Justice John Roberts clashed over one explosive charge. Did she knowingly spread federal misinformation? Or was she being silenced for exposing racial injustice buried deep in the system? Roberts moved to end her career with a lifetime disbarment and criminal conviction. But just minutes later, Jasmine turned the entire hearing upside down with evidence no one saw coming. Roberts fled in silence, and within the hour and within hours, a Senate summons was issued for the Chief Justice himself. What evidence did Jasmine reveal that turned the most powerful judge in America into the nation's newest suspect? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under a leaden Washington, D.C. sky, the marble facade of the Supreme Court loomed like a monument not to justice, but to silence. Inside, in a rarely used high-security chamber outfitted with live-feed cameras, a so-called administrative review was about to begin. The nation was watching, though few understood what they were truly witnessing. The docket read like a formality, a hearing on conduct unbecoming of a federal representative. But behind closed doors, something darker was moving. Jasmine Crockett, U.S. Congresswoman and seasoned attorney, had been summoned alone to answer vague charges regarding public misinformation. No subpoena, no defense notice, just a cold, formal letter. The kind that didn't invite argument, only punishment. She entered the chamber without ceremony. No crowd, no press pool following her through the corridors. The silence was louder than any protest. Jasmine, known for going toe-to-toe with some of the most powerful men in Congress, now walked into a courtroom where even the architecture felt like it was closing in. Above her, the seal of the Supreme Court hung like a noose. Seated at the bench, not a magistrate, not a panel, but Chief Justice John Roberts himself. He hadn't presided over a disciplinary hearing in more than a decade, and now he was here, for her. No one called her name. No clerk read charges. Roberts raised his gavel before she even sat down. The accusation was brutal in its simplicity. Knowingly disseminating false and inflammatory statements regarding a sealed federal case involving racial misconduct. Jasmine had, during a televised panel, exposed what she claimed was judicial bias in a case involving a young black man beaten during arrest. She cited sources, referenced filings, but now they called it incitement. They said her words endangered judicial integrity. She had become too loud, too specific, and now the most powerful judge in America had taken it upon himself to shut her down on live television. What was meant to be a quiet hearing had been weaponized into a public execution of credibility, and Jasmine Crockett, armed only with facts, was sitting in the crosshairs. The moment Jasmine reached for her documents, the gavel struck, not once but twice, sharp and deliberate, like a warning shot fired straight at her resolve. There was no motion to open the floor, no invitation for remarks, no acknowledgement of her presence beyond the name printed on the docket. Chief Justice John Roberts didn't look up from his notes. His voice was even, detached, and disturbingly procedural, as if reading from a pre-written script no one else had seen. Representative Jasmine Crockett, he began, this court, under the authority granted by Article 42.8b in emergency administrative discretion, finds cause for immediate disciplinary action. A long pause followed, not for consideration, but for dramatic weight, because the judgment was already written. You are hereby permanently disbarred from the practice of law in all U.S. jurisdictions, effective immediately, irrevocably, without eligibility for appeal or future reinstatement. And then, with the same cold tone, Roberts delivered the second blow. Furthermore, he said, this matter is referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. The charges, incitement of public unrest and intentional degradation of judicial credibility. He looked up only then, his gaze sharp and surgical. The recommended sentence, pending federal review, is 3 years probation with full restriction from any public legal engagement. The term was clear, a felony-level conviction, suspended but still imposed. Jasmine was no longer just permanently disbarred. She was now branded a threat to national order. No indictment hearing, no grand jury, No right to refute. Just a declaration from the highest bench in the land, executed live on camera. Not a single document had been presented. No inquiry, no evidence chain. The accusation of incitement referred to Jasmine's appearance on national television, where she condemned a sealed racial profiling case in Missouri. She had named no parties. She had cited no confidential files. But her words, her tone, had been enough. They called it inflammatory. They called it dangerous. They called it a crime. And just like that, in under 2 minutes, she had gone from respected lawmaker to defendant of a crime never debated, never proven, and never cross-examined. The courtroom didn't just fall silent. It turned inward, tense like a wire ready to snap. Staffers didn't dare move. The reporters scribbled in the stunned disbelief. Even the stenographer paused before recording Roberts' last words. Jasmine sat motionless, her spine straight, her hands now flat against the desk. She had been condemned without speaking a word, and that silence wasn't accidental, it was institutional. This wasn't just about punishing her for what she said. It was about punishing her for saying it too well, for making the public listen, for threatening a structure that had survived for so long by bearing voices like hers beneath layers of decorum and legal fog. This wasn't a verdict, it was a purge, carried out in real time, on national television, with the cold precision of a man who believed no one would dare question him. And Jasmine Crockett, without warning, without counsel, without a single chance to speak, had just been made an example. The ruling had fallen like a blade, but Jasmine Crockett did not break, not in posture, not in presence. She remained seated for a long second, her hands resting on the desk as if weighing every ounce of the moment. Around her, the courtroom pulsed with something no gavel could silence. Disbelief, tightly coiled and waiting to explode. The cameras were still rolling. The reporters' pens hovered midair. Every lens, every eye, every breath in that room was fixed on her. And then, quietly without drama, she stood. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't performance. It was clarity made visible. She rose not like someone who had just been condemned, but like someone who refused to let that condemnation define her. Her back was straight, her chin leveled. Her silence in that moment was louder than anything Roberts had said. She reached down, unlatched her leather briefcase, and opened it with practiced precision. The soft click of the metal clasp echoed through the stillness. No trembling hands, no frantic movement, just deliberate calm. She pulled a single folder to the surface, but didn't open it yet. Instead, she placed both hands flat on the desk and looked up. Not at the ceiling, not at the gallery, but straight at the Chief Justice of the United States. Her voice, when it came, was low and firm, not loud, but anchored by conviction. "If I can't speak here," she said, "then what you're protecting is no longer the law. It's your own throne." She paused, then added, "You didn't silence me. You revealed yourself." Her gaze didn't waver. "And the people watching, they see it too." A beat passed, then another, and still no one moved. The room, moments ago ruled by Robert's gavel, now belonged to her. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't pleading, she wasn't playing the victim. She was naming the truth in a space designed to deny it. The silence that followed wasn't the result of protocol. It was disbelief wrapped in recognition. The stenographer's fingers hovered over the keys, unsure if they were still allowed to transcribe. The clerk stared forward, eyes locked, uncertain whether to acknowledge what had just been said. Even the cameras, operated by seasoned media technicians who'd seen hundreds of hearings, zoomed in without being asked, sensing the shift in gravity. Roberts didn't respond, not right away, but his smile, tight and thin, betrayed something he rarely let show: tension. He sat straighter, hands curling around the edge of the bench as if anchoring himself. His eyes, once filled with cold assurance, now scanned the room, registering what he couldn't stop. Jasmine had taken a hearing scripted to destroy her and turned it into a moment of reckoning. And beyond the walls of the courtroom, across the country, viewers who had tuned in expecting a fall were suddenly watching a stand. On screens large and small, from Capitol Hill offices to living rooms in Detroit, Phoenix, and Charleston, her words were already reverberating. And in the space of a single sentence, Jasmine Crockett was no longer the defendant. She was the question the court couldn't silence. And just as the silence settled into something heavy and irreversible, Jasmine Crockett did what no one expected. She leaned in. Not with rage, not with desperation, but with purpose. She reached into her folder and pulled out the first document with slow, practiced fingers. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't quiver. She was surrounded by cameras, cornered by power, but still, she read. Title 5, U.S. Code, Section 7521, she began, her voice clear and firm. It states that no federal employee, attorney, or otherwise can be subjected to disciplinary action without prior notice, access to the full record, and the opportunity to respond. She paused, letting the words hang. This morning I received no notice. I was given no record, and I was certainly given no opportunity to respond. Her eyes lifted slowly, locking onto Roberts. You didn't enforce the law. You bypassed it. The room grew still again, but this time it was a different silence. Not shock, not confusion, recognition. Jasmine turned to the second page, holding it up slightly so that both the bench and the cameras could see the federal seal clearly printed at the top. Title 28, Section 530B, she continued. Federal attorneys are bound to the same ethical standards as state bar members, including those relating to due process and the right to a fair hearing. She laid the page flat, her finger resting on the paragraph in question. By proceeding without presenting evidence, by issuing a penalty before a defense could be mounted, this court has violated the very code it claims to uphold. Her voice sharpened but never rose. And that makes your ruling not just unjust, but unlawful. Still standing, she reached for the final document, a Supreme Court precedent. Matthews versus Eldridge, 424 U.S. 319, 1976, she said, citing the case slowly, deliberately. It states, the fundamental requirement of due process is the opportunity to be heard at a meaningful time and in a meaningful manner. She let that sink in. Tell me, Chief Justice, she said, looking directly at Roberts, when exactly was I supposed to be heard? Before you read a verdict written before I walked in? Before you accused me of crimes with no hearing, no evidence, no discovery? Her tone didn't tremble, but it pressed like weight added inch by inch to a system already cracking under its own hypocrisy. Her words weren't legalese. They weren't deflections. They were facts, measured, exact, and placed with care like a surgeon cutting into a wound no one else had the courage to touch. She wasn't just invoking the law, she was holding it up like a mirror. And in that mirror, Roberts didn't see justice. He saw himself, and the reflection wasn't clean. Jasmine hadn't come to beg for her license. She had come to prove that the court was already guilty of what it accused her of, undermining the Constitution. And in less than 5 minutes, without raising her voice, she had done exactly that. And just when the courtroom thought Jasmine Crockett had played her strongest hand, she reached for something that didn't come from any statute book or court precedent, but from deep inside the system itself. She turned toward the court's audio-visual terminal with a stillness that commanded silence. In her hand was a slim black remote. She didn't need to raise her voice. One word was enough: Exhibit C. With a soft click, the screen behind her came to life, illuminating the chamber in a sterile digital glow. A subject line appeared in bold: Strategic Resolution, Crockett Licensing Termination. Below it, a timestamp, an internal court address, and the name of a senior administrative clerk from the Chief Justice's chambers. Jasmine stepped aside, letting the screen speak for itself. Then, without hesitation, she turned back to face the room. This email, she said steadily, was forwarded to me by a source inside this courthouse. It outlines a meeting, closed door, off record, held last Tuesday. A meeting attended by Chief Justice Roberts and by 3 senior advisors representing outside political organizations with vested interests in silencing this investigation. She didn't editorialize. She didn't speculate. She read, word for word, quote, given Crockett's rising public influence in her recent televised statements, the recommendation is full revocation of her license and immediate procedural closure. Ensure optics are controlled. Avoid opening the floor to unnecessary defense. Her voice didn't tremble. It cut. That was written days before I received any notice of this hearing, before any charges were read, before I even knew I had been accused of anything. She paused, her gaze scanning the gallery, landing on the court reporters, the clerks, the public. This was not an investigation. It was a sentence, pre-approved, pre-negotiated, pre-written. She advanced to the next page. Names appeared, clear, traceable, damning. Jasmine highlighted the line that mattered most. Chief Justice Roberts has confirmed alignment and is prepared to proceed. The courtroom didn't just freeze, it tightened, as though the building itself recognized what had just been revealed. This court, she continued, is not acting on law. It is executing a plan, a coordinated plan to strip an elected official of her professional standing without evidence, without hearing, and without the public ever knowing it was decided long before today began. Her voice remained level, but every syllable landed like a nail. This wasn't just a miscarriage of justice. It was a betrayal of the very system you were sworn to protect. Even the lighting felt harsher now, as if exposing what had been hidden. Roberts didn't interrupt. Couldn't. His hands, once calmly folded, were now clenched on the edge of the bench. His face was still, but his body language betrayed a truth no ruling could conceal. Jasmine had peeled back the curtain, and behind it wasn't law, it was manipulation. The viewers watching across the nation weren't just seeing a woman defend herself, they were seeing how power conspires in the dark, until someone forces it into the light. The email had landed like an explosion, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished, not even close. She stepped back from the display screen, her voice steady, her posture unshaken, and then, without shifting her tone, without warning, she turned toward the bench and said calmly, "Your Honor, the defense calls its first and only witness." A ripple tore through the courtroom like a sudden gust of wind slamming through locked doors. There hadn't been any witness list submitted, no pre-approved deposition, no prior notice. The rules had already been broken by the court, and now Jasmine was returning the favor. From the gallery, a tall man rose slowly, dressed in a gray suit that seemed far too understated for what he was about to do. His steps were slow, not out of fear, but gravity, as if each footfall carried the weight of a secret too long buried. When he reached the front and raised his right hand to take the oath, the air in the chamber turned electric. Jasmine's voice rang out again, clear, controlled. "State your name and occupation for the record." The man nodded, gaze forward, jaw locked. "Thomas K. Elridge," he said, "former Deputy Legal Counsel to the Department of Justice under President George W. Bush." There were murmurs now, subtle but undeniable. Reporters' pens scratched faster. Camera lenses refocused. Everyone in the chamber knew that name. He had once been a rising star in conservative legal circles, then vanished from public life nearly a decade ago without explanation. And now here he was, swearing under oath in defense of Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine took a step forward, her voice low but razor sharp. "Mr. Elridge, can you explain to this court the nature of the meeting you were asked to attend 6 months ago in relation to me?" He didn't blink. "Yes," he said. "I was invited to a strategy session with several unnamed consultants tied to federal judicial advisory groups. I was told in plain terms that the goal was to discredit Representative Crockett, to catch her in a public error, to provoke her, on record, and if possible, to use that moment to justify a permanent disbarment." The words hit like a slap across the room. There was no legalese, no ambiguity, just a blunt admission that what had happened here today had been orchestrated months ago, behind closed doors, by people who had no interest in the Constitution, only control. Jasmine's expression remained calm, but her fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, grounding herself in the moment. "Were you given any instruction on how to provoke this response?" she asked. Elridge nodded once. "Yes, I was told to engage her on racial policy, to use inflammatory examples, to bait her into overreaching so it could be presented as misconduct. I was told, quote, 'The optics matter more than the facts.'" A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the gallery. The tension was no longer just heavy, it was radiating. Jasmine nodded slowly. "And did you comply with those instructions?" she asked. Elridge's voice dropped a register. "No," he said. "That's why I'm here." She let the silence carry that answer for a moment, then walked toward the bench, standing halfway between Roberts and the witness. "To be clear," she said, her voice resonating in every inch of the courtroom, "you are testifying that there was a coordinated effort, not based on legal conduct, not based on ethics, but based on political pressure, to remove me from the legal profession altogether?" Elridge didn't hesitate. "Yes, the goal," he said, turning now to face Roberts directly, "was not justice. It was silencing. They feared her voice, not her arguments." His tone didn't tremble. He didn't blink. And though his suit was pressed and his tone measured, it was clear this was a man carrying the burden of complicity and trying now to set something right. The impact was immediate and undeniable. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of order. It felt like a place under siege, not from Jasmine, but from the truth. Even the guards at the back of the chamber exchanged uncertain glances. The court reporter's fingers moved furiously, trying to keep pace with history being made word by word. Roberts said nothing, but the red in his knuckles as he gripped the edge of the bench deepened. Jasmine turned to face the gallery, her voice rising, not in volume, but in certainty. "What you're witnessing right now isn't an outburst. It's not grandstanding. It's exposure." She turned back toward Elridge. "And Mr. Elridge, why now? Why break silence?" The man took a breath, then answered with the kind of brutal honesty that clears rooms. "Because I watched this machine devour too many people for too long. I told myself I was just part of the structure. But today I saw the structure collapse, and I refuse to be quiet while it takes someone else down with it." Jasmine let that answer stand untouched. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. The moment had outgrown any performance. This wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about truth, delivered raw and unflinching from someone who had once helped build the system, now trying to destroy her. She turned back to the bench, her voice flat, final. "You claimed I was a threat to judicial credibility. But the real threat isn't exposure. It's silence. And you've spent this entire proceeding trying to enforce silence." The room had shifted. The power dynamic had inverted. What began as a hearing meant to humiliate her had now become a tribunal exposing the rot at the core of the institution. And Roberts, once the untouchable figure cloaked in ceremonial authority, now sat beneath the weight of two things he could no longer control: the record and the truth. The woman he had tried to erase was now backed by a voice from inside his own walls, a man with nothing to gain, a man who had no reason to lie, the kind of witness no ruling can easily dismiss. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply walked back to her seat, her heels echoing through the chamber like a slow, deliberate countdown. Not to the end of the hearing, but to the end of something far bigger. But just as the truth began to settle like smoke in the room, thick, undeniable, inescapable, Chief Justice John Roberts shifted in his seat, straightening his robe with a slow, methodical motion that betrayed the tension surging beneath it. His composure had cracked, however slightly, and now he was reaching, not for justice, but for control. His voice, when it returned, was sharp-edged and too steady, like someone reciting a script they didn't fully believe. "This court," he began, "will not be derailed by false testimony or politically motivated stunts." He turned to face the witness, though his words were clearly aimed at the gallery, the cameras, and the millions watching. "Mr. Elridge's claims are wholly unsubstantiated. He presents no formal record, no documentation, no corroboration of any kind." He paused there, allowing the assertion to hang in the air like a smokescreen, hoping perhaps that volume and tone could replace what the facts would not. "This is a courtroom," he continued, voice tightening, "not a stage. And the law, real law, is not swayed by rumor or dramatic performance." His eyes flicked toward Jasmine, not with the detachment of a judge, but with the coldness of a man who had just seen the scaffolding around his power begin to shift. "Representative Crockett," he said, his voice narrowing into something more personal. You've made your point, but let's be clear. This court does not accept fabricated conspiracies as evidence. Not today, not ever. The courtroom felt colder now, not because of the words, but because of what they revealed. It wasn't just denial, it was erasure. It was an institution watching its own reflection crack and choosing to smash the mirror rather than confront what it saw. Even the court stenographer paused, barely noticeable, a hesitation of fingers, but enough to be felt. Jasmine stood still, unflinching. Her face betrayed no shock, no outrage, just the quiet, almost solemn recognition that this exact response was the final confirmation of everything she had tried to prove. Roberts wasn't defending justice. He was defending the illusion of order, and he was doing it not with facts, but with power. I will strike Mr. Elridge's testimony from the official record, Roberts added, voice clipped. It will not factor into the outcome of this proceeding. The sentence hit like an eraser across the chalkboard of accountability, but it didn't undo what had been said. It didn't unsay the quote the nation had just heard. They feared her voice, not her arguments. It didn't wipe away the email, the leak, the quiet trembling in Roberts' own hands. And Jasmine knew it. She didn't need to object. She didn't need to shout. Because in that moment, the people watching weren't looking to the bench for truth anymore. They were looking to her, and if Roberts thought dismissing a witness could suffocate the momentum building in that courtroom, Jasmine Crockett proved otherwise. She hadn't just come armed with testimony. She had come with proof. She returned to the center of the chamber, her steps slow and deliberate, as though each footfall was calculated to remind the room that she wasn't intimidated. She was anchoring in. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than before, but it carried more weight. Since this court has chosen to strike live testimony, perhaps it will listen to what cannot be erased: records, filings, signatures, government stamps. She placed a thick binder on the desk in front of her, its worn edges and color-coded tabs, signaling just how many hours had gone into assembling it. Then she looked directly at the bench. I have 4 cases, 4 examples, each documented, each verified, each ignored, but not today. She opened the binder, revealing the first tab. Case 1, United States v. DeAndre Milton, 2016. A federal prosecution out of Alabama. The trial judge flagged the case for insufficient evidence publicly and requested dismissal. But within 72 hours, that same judge reversed course after receiving a direct communication from this court's chambers, specifically a memo bearing Chief Justice Roberts' digital signature. The content of that message? Consider institutional stability. Jasmine lifted the printed memo. Milton was convicted, served 18 months, and was later cleared in a separate civil suit. No apology, no reinstatement, just silence. She turned to the next tab, her hands steady. Case 2, Financial Disclosure Omission, 2017 to 2020. The Chief Justice failed to disclose over $1.2 million in financial instruments held through a layered family trust. Normally, this would fall under judicial ethics review, except the Oversight Committee never saw the documents. Why? Because they were reclassified internally through an emergency designation signed by Roberts himself. The same year, the court ruled 5-4 in favor of a telecom conglomerate whose stock price directly impacted the value of that same trust. When questioned, Roberts called it, quote, a procedural misunderstanding. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, but her next words cut. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was concealment. She flipped to the third tab. Case 3, NRE, Malik Green, 2019, a prominent civil rights attorney. No prior disciplinary record. Accused anonymously of conduct unbecoming after delivering a speech criticizing federal sentencing disparities. The panel reviewing his case requested time to investigate. Instead, they received a formal letter, this one signed personally by the Chief Justice, urging immediate suspension to preserve public trust. Green's license was suspended. The allegation was later withdrawn. The complaint ruled baseless. But for 27 months, he couldn't practice. 27 months. His clients were reassigned. His income vanished. His reputation was shredded, and no explanation was ever given. Jasmine paused, letting that sink in before turning to the final tab. Her voice grew even quieter, almost reverent, but there was steel in it. Case 4, Jane Doe v. Federal Ethics Committee, 2021, an internal whistleblower at the Administrative Office of the Courts. She alleged procedural interference in the audit selection process. Specifically, that case reviews were being manipulated based on political affiliations. One of her memos, submitted under protected status, was leaked, then traced back to a private server maintained by the Chief Justice's digital clerk. When pressed, no investigation followed. She was offered a transfer. She refused. She resigned. And just like that, a voice from inside the machine disappeared. Jasmine stepped back slightly, letting the binder remain open, documents visible to the bench and to the cameras. She didn't pace. She didn't perform. She let the evidence speak with its own quiet devastation. "I'm not here to accuse. I'm here to expose," she said, her voice unwavering. "These aren't theories. They're records, official memos, internal emails, signed rulings, and yet not a single one was brought to light until now. Why? Because they weren't supposed to be." She turned and faced Roberts directly, not with aggression, but with unblinking clarity. "You came here today to end my career, but I came here to hold you accountable. And you should understand something very clearly, Chief Justice. I'm not standing here because I'm reckless. I'm standing here because I kept receipts. And those receipts are heavier than any robe you wear." The courtroom was silent again, but not out of shock. Out of recognition. Recognition that what they were watching was no longer a defense. It was a reckoning, and it had just begun. And as the final document settled into place, the courtroom seemed to shift, not in volume, but in gravity. What had once been a theater of control was now a room suspended between collapse and awakening. The evidence Jasmine had laid bare was not speculative, not rhetorical. It was undeniable. And in that moment, the silence wasn't passive. It was tense, pulsing, like a held breath across the bench itself. Justice Elena Marlowe was the first to break it. Her chair creaked as she stood, the robe around her shoulders suddenly feeling less like authority and more like weight. "In light of these revelations," she said, carefully choosing each word, "I move that this court enter immediate recess. These documents, this testimony, they warrant independent review before we proceed." Her voice was calm, but behind her measured tone was something unmistakable: alarm. She wasn't trying to stop Jasmine. She was trying to stop the floor from giving out beneath them all. A few seats away, Justice Alan Mercer followed suit, rising with a nod so slight it almost looked like shame. "Seconded," he said, his voice rougher. "The legitimacy of this proceeding has been brought into serious question. Continuing without scrutiny would not only be reckless, it would dishonor this court's obligation to fairness." The words should have felt like a lifeline. To anyone else, they might have. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't thank them, didn't retreat into procedure. She stepped forward, not as a petitioner, but as a woman unwilling to let delay replace accountability. Her voice was quiet but resonant, like the calm before a second storm. "No," she said firmly. Her eyes moved from Marlowe to Mercer, and then, finally, to Roberts. "Respectfully, this institution has had years to look inward. It has had decades to reflect on its own contradictions. I'm not here to help it find the courage to do so." A hush fell over the courtroom, not out of confusion, but clarity. Jasmine inhaled once, slow and steady. Then she said what no one else in that room dared to. "No more delays. No more procedural shields. Either justice is blind or it's complicit." The words didn't echo. They sank, deep, final, irreversible. She wasn't calling for civility. She was demanding a reckoning. And in that moment, every person in that chamber, from the justices above to the viewers watching live across the country, knew the truth. What they did next would reveal not just what they believed about Jasmine Crockett, but what they believed about justice itself. The moment Jasmine Crockett's voice faded into the silence of the courtroom, firm, unforgiving, and impossible to ignore, the impact began to ripple beyond the marble walls. What started as a single moment of defiance now detonated into a national reckoning. The camera feeds capturing the hearing, previously routine broadcasts buried on C-SPAN and legal networks, were now being spliced and replayed across every major news outlet in the country. CNN broke in with breaking: Crockett accuses Chief Justice of coordinated political targeting. MSNBC followed with full-screen graphics showing leaked memos. Even traditionally neutral networks were forced to pivot, with anchors muttering that something unprecedented is unfolding inside the Supreme Court. The clip of Jasmine standing alone declaring, "Either justice is blind or it's complicit," aired 18 times in the first hour. By the second hour, the internet had seized control. The hashtag RobertsGate wasn't just trending, it was metastasizing. On X, formerly Twitter, it surged past 4 million posts in under 90 minutes. Reddit forums lit up, dissecting frame by frame the court footage. Legal analysts who had dismissed Jasmine as reckless were now analyzing her binder tab by tab in live streams with hundreds of thousands of viewers. TikTok exploded with explainers from law students and former clerks, laying out just how damning each of her exhibits were. Even conservative influencers, normally eager to discredit her, went silent. Then came the moment that shifted the pressure from scandal to crisis. Jasmine's evidence portal, opened quietly by her legal team the night before, hit 12 million views in 4 hours. It wasn't just the binder anymore. It was downloadable, clickable, searchable. Receipts for the entire nation to see. PDFs of the internal memos, annotated court opinions, audio clips from prior proceedings where Roberts had hinted at coordination. In one particularly damning file, the memo titled Preemptive Stability Briefing outlined language nearly identical to Roberts' own opening remarks that morning. Analysts at ProPublica began posting side-by-side comparisons. Leaks from Capitol Hill soon followed, emails between senior clerks and think tank lobbyists, all timed within days of Jasmine's prior press appearances. Each file opened felt less like a revelation and more like an indictment, and the people were reading it, furious, engaged, unafraid. Across the country, protests began to form, not with placards and chants, but with laptops, press badges, and court filings. A group of legal scholars from Columbia, Yale, and Stanford co-signed an emergency petition demanding an independent tribunal to investigate Chief Justice Roberts for judicial misconduct. Public integrity watchdogs filed requests under the Freedom of Information Act within hours. And perhaps most telling of all, congressional staffers began quietly returning calls they had been ignoring for months. A single hearing, once meant to shame one woman into silence, had unraveled into something far larger, a citizen-led audit of the most powerful bench in the country. In newsrooms, editors scrambled to assign special investigations. "How deep does it go?" one headline read on The Atlantic. "What did the other justices know?" asked the New York Times. Meanwhile, Jasmine's words were being translated into other languages, broadcast on Al Jazeera, Sky News, and BBC with subtitles. Images of her standing, alone but unbowed, became symbolic across the globe. Artists started sketching her in real time. Posters appeared in front of law schools from Boston to Berkeley. Civil rights groups that had gone quiet in recent years reignited. Calls for transparency, for reform, for consequences. By nightfall, the political temperature had shifted violently. Members of the House Judiciary Committee, both left and right, were forced to comment. Several issued vague statements about reviewing procedural protocols, but it wasn't enough. Jasmine's documents weren't theory. They were evidence, and the nation had already read them. By 9 p.m., RobertsGate had crossed 12 million tweets. By midnight, Jasmine's binder had been downloaded more than 25 million times. And in every download, in every screen share, there was a silent agreement forming. Not just that she was right, but that the court had crossed a line that could no longer be ignored. What made the movement unstoppable wasn't just the content, it was the clarity. Jasmine hadn't just exposed corruption, she had made it readable, tangible, human, no legalese, no obfuscation, just page after page of cold administrative betrayal. People weren't just outraged, they were empowered. University deans issued open letters demanding resignations. Bar associations in 6 states announced emergency reviews of their judicial ethics protocols. Former judges began speaking out. And in one particularly viral moment, a retired federal prosecutor wept on live TV saying, "I never thought I'd see the day when the Constitution was defended not from the bench, but against it." Meanwhile, Jasmine stayed quiet. No interviews, no press blitz, no reaction videos. She didn't need to speak. Her work was already speaking for her. Every time the camera replayed her standing before the court, alone, uncompromising, the message was reinforced. This wasn't just about her. It was about the people the court had quietly crushed for years. The immigrant fined without a hearing. The attorney suspended without cause. The veteran stripped of due process by a misfiled form. All the stories no one televised, until now. And as the movement swelled, so did the stakes. Legal analysts warned this wasn't just a scandal. It was a legitimacy crisis. What happens when the highest court is caught coordinating outcomes? What happens when silence is no longer respected, but weaponized? Even allies of the Chief Justice grew nervous. Editorials in the Wall Street Journal suggested a leave of absence to restore confidence. Calls poured into the Senate Judiciary Committee for a full inquiry, and somewhere inside the Supreme Court, a man who once opened hearings with unchecked authority now sat alone, watching the country ask, "What else have you buried?" Jasmine had not sought to become a symbol, but they had made her one. Not of defiance, but of undeniable truth in the face of institutional gaslighting. And by the end of the day, as cities across America projected her final words onto courthouse walls in blazing light, it became impossible to look away. Either justice is blind or it's complicit. And now the world was watching to see which one it would be. And while the world outside boiled with anger and clarity, inside that courtroom, the very place designed to symbolize order, time stood still. For nearly an hour, Chief Justice John Roberts did not speak. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rule. He didn't even blink. He sat there, spine rigid, hands frozen against the carved mahogany bench, eyes locked somewhere far beyond the walls. The camera remained fixed on him, but the image didn't change. A man built of ceremony and control, now reduced to stillness, trapped beneath the weight of something he'd long believed he could outrun: accountability. The chamber remained breathless. No one dared fill the silence. Not the justices flanking him, not the clerks at their stations. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably in place, unsure whether the moment demanded force or reverence. Jasmine Crockett stood unmoved, her arms folded lightly across the binder that had cracked the fortress from the inside. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence, unshaken, unapologetic, was the final argument. For 58 minutes and 43 seconds, the room waited. Not for reconciliation, but for collapse. Not for justice, but for the end of denial. Then finally Roberts moved. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he pushed his chair back with a low, scraping groan that seemed to echo louder than the gavel that had started the day. He rose, his legs were steady, but his posture was not. He looked not like a judge presiding, but like a man standing at his own sentencing. The gallery tensed. Every journalist in the room leaned forward, pens already pressed to paper, waiting for words that might explain everything or excuse nothing. His voice was not what it once was. Gone was the crisp edge of authority, the refined cadence of a man used to controlling rooms with just his tone. What came instead was hoarse, flat, mechanical. "This court," he said, barely above a whisper, "is adjourned until further notice." He didn't elaborate. He didn't clarify. There was no formal closure, no indication of when or if the session would resume. And above all, there was no apology, no admission, no retraction, no responsibility. He turned from the bench without waiting for protocol. No final gavel, no ceremonial exit. Just the sound of his robes brushing against the polished wood as he stepped down and walked away. But as he passed the gallery, his eyes flicked up. Just once. They landed on Jasmine. And in that fleeting second, something cracked behind them. Not anger, not regret, fear. The kind of fear that doesn't come from losing power, but from realizing the illusion of invincibility had finally shattered. He disappeared into the judge's chamber without another word. But outside the courtroom, across the country, across the screens, across the Capitol, that silence was already being answered. 12 minutes later, while journalists still scrambled to process what had just happened, a new alert broke across every major network. Breaking Senate Judiciary Committee issues. Emergency summons for Chief Justice John Roberts. Closed-door hearing scheduled within 72 hours regarding allegations of judicial misconduct, financial non-disclosure, and abuse of influence. It wasn't a leak. It wasn't speculation. It was an official order, signed, sealed, and made public. For the first time in modern history, the highest judicial officer in the United States was no longer shielded by robe or rank. He was being called, not to rule, but to answer. And the timing wasn't lost on anyone. It came within 15 minutes of Jasmine Crockett's final evidence upload, time-stamped, verified, and reviewed live by over 21 million people. The country, still catching its breath, felt the ground shift beneath it once more. This wasn't just about corruption. It wasn't just about injustice. It was about a system that had finally been forced to look in the mirror. And the man who once sat at the very top of that system had just walked out of the courtroom. Not as a guardian of law, but as its subject. Back inside, Jasmine didn't speak. She simply lowered her hands to the table, closed her binder, and slowly exhaled. She hadn't come for vengeance. She hadn't asked for victory. She had asked for truth. And now, finally, it was no longer just hers to carry. It belonged to the nation. The gavel never struck again that day. But history did. Hard. And it began with a woman who refused to stay silent in the face of silence. And as the headlines exploded and the Chief Justice vanished behind locked chamber doors, the cameras searched for Jasmine Crockett, for a reaction, a victory lap, a soundbite. They didn't find one. While the nation circled the ruins of the highest courtroom in the land, Jasmine disappeared into silence. Not out of fear, not out of exhaustion, but because she knew something no one else did yet. The real trial wasn't over. It was only beginning. She didn't wait for reinstatement, didn't petition for her law license back. And when political operatives approached her about launching a Senate campaign, offering full backing, media rollout, donor lists, she walked out of the meeting before dessert was served. They were still playing a game she no longer believed in. Because what had happened in that courtroom wasn't about her credentials. It was about something far more dangerous. How the system had evolved not to protect justice, but to strategically erase those who demanded it. So instead of going back to court, Jasmine Crockett built her own weapon. No marble columns, no gavels, no bench. Just concrete floors, flickering lights, and a laptop that hadn't been updated in 5 years. That was her new office, a former municipal records warehouse in the southeast corridor of Washington, D.C., barely retrofitted, still smelling of dust and old ink. But the people who walked through its doors didn't come for aesthetic. They came because it was the only place left that believed them. She called it the unheard defense. Not a law firm, not a think tank, not a nonprofit playing dress-up for corporate donors. It was a frontline bunker for people chewed up and spit out by legal systems that operated more like machines than courts. Her mission was singular and radical, to represent those who had already been denied representation. Not because they weren't innocent, but because their cases were too quiet to matter. She took no salary. She signed no press deals. She turned down 3 major network interviews and refused to ghostwrite a memoir that would have paid her millions. If you want a book, she told a journalist once, read the transcripts of the people this system destroyed and then forgot. The next morning, her inbox was flooded, not with praise, but with over 2,000 case submissions. From all 50 states, from people who had lost homes, licenses, custody, careers, all without ever stepping foot in a courtroom. Her first client was a teenage boy from Detroit named Quincy, expelled from public school after AI surveillance flagged his Instagram post as threatening. The post? A video of him rapping about police violence, using lyrics pulled from real news footage. No charges, no hearing, just an email to his mother. Your son's enrollment has been terminated. Jasmine flew to Detroit herself. She didn't walk into the superintendent's office. She walked into the auditorium during morning assembly and read the lyrics out loud to 800 students. Then she read the email. "You don't need to break the law to be punished anymore," she said. "You just need to be inconvenient." The video went viral in 6 hours, but she didn't stay to bask in it. She was already on a plane to Texas, where a woman named Soledad had been fined $14,000 for unauthorized signage after putting up flyers demanding clean water in her town. When she refused to remove them, a county court issued a lien on her home. No hearing, no appeal, just a system that could crush you with paper instead of steel. In the months that followed, the unheard defense filed over 270 challenges across administrative courts, education boards, housing commissions, and parole panels. None of the cases made primetime. That was the point. Jasmine had no interest in building headlines. She was building a shadow legal network, one built not on status but survival. She hired attorneys who had been disbarred for defending whistleblowers, clerks who were fired for flagging ethical violations, tech workers who had built the very algorithms that now blacklisted people in silence. Her intake staff were trained not in courtroom etiquette, but in listening to stories no one had ever bothered to hear. And above the war room entrance, spray painted on the exposed brick in thick black lettering, were the words she had first said in court. "Either justice is blind or it's complicit." That sentence became their mission, their warning, their brand. They printed it on shirts, mailed it to every district judge they filed against, carved it into the footer of every single brief they submitted. And though she refused any formal title, Jasmine was now the axis of something the country couldn't ignore anymore. Not a rebellion, not a party, but a reckoning. And while the Roberts scandal spiraled into hearings, subpoenas, resignations, and law school lectures dissecting the Crockett effect, Jasmine wasn't at any podium. She was in rural Alabama, defending a black preacher arrested for disturbing peace after ringing a bell too loud during Sunday Mass. She was in Milwaukee fighting to restore SSI benefits to an amputee veteran after an algorithm marked him as uncooperative. She was in Phoenix arguing for a janitor who lost his job because he clicked no on a workplace mental health survey. She didn't wear robes. She didn't wear suits. She wore hoodies, boots, and grief. And when asked, inevitably, why she never sought to restore her license, she gave the same answer every time. "They never took my power. They just gave me clarity." That clarity became contagious. Within a year, the unheard defense opened 5 satellite hubs: Atlanta, Denver, Cleveland, Oakland, and Baton Rouge. Entire networks of volunteer law students, retired judges, and trauma counselors joined the mission. Not to speak for the voiceless, but to make systems listen to voices they trained themselves not to hear. And for every case they won, for every policy they overturned, Jasmine never posted a single victory announcement. No banners, no balloons. Just a single email to her team. One down. Who's next? The country kept waiting for her to burn out. But she didn't, because what powered her wasn't rage. It was the memory of how close she came to being erased. Not by bullets, but by bureaucracy, by documents, by silence wrapped in formality. And now she made sure that silence had to answer for itself, one case at a time. She didn't win every battle, but she made sure every injustice she touched was no longer invisible. That alone, in a system addicted to hiding its own cruelty, was revolution. And Jasmine Crockett, once silenced, once sentenced, had become its sharpest voice. And yet, even as Jasmine Crockett walked out of that courtroom, stripped of her title, her license, and everything she'd earned inside the system, what followed was not defeat, it was revelation. Because what she unearthed wasn't just corruption, it wasn't just a powerful man falling from grace, it was the lie America tells itself every time someone with power says, "Justice will be served." She hadn't walked into that hearing to make history. She had walked in to survive it. And somehow she turned survival into fire. The cameras turned off. The news cycle shifted. But Jasmine didn't. She remained where most couldn't stay, in the raw aftermath of exposed injustice. And from that silence, from that slow, smoldering wreckage of procedure and prestige, something deeper began to emerge. Not a ruling, not a reversal, but a reckoning. It wasn't televised. It wasn't trending. but it was happening, one person at a time, one case at a time, one voice, long ignored, now asking, if this could happen to her, what's already happening to me? That's the real lesson. Not that power corrupts. We already knew that. Not that systems can fail. We've seen that too. The true horror is how many people are crushed by those failures long before anyone with a microphone decides to care. Jasmine's story wasn't rare. It was just visible. And that visibility became her most dangerous weapon. Because when people saw her, standing alone, disbarred, defamed, and still unyielding, they didn't just see a woman resisting injustice. They saw a mirror, a warning, and most importantly, a blueprint. She taught us that injustice doesn't arrive wearing a uniform or kicking down your door. Most days it arrives quietly, through a letter in the mail, an unanswered phone call, a courtroom that skips your name. It arrives dressed in professionalism, spoken in calm voices, backed by signatures, titles, process. But that doesn't make it less violent. It makes it harder to fight. Because when the world doesn't believe you've been wronged, how do you prove your pain? Jasmine never gave that question an abstract answer. She gave it a body, her own. She let herself become the case, the target, the test. Not because she wanted to, but because she refused to let fear do what power couldn't. Shut her up. And in that choice, she exposed something few are willing to say out loud. The system is not broken. It was built this way, to delay, to confuse, to outlast. And when it cannot win with logic, it wins with exhaustion. But Jasmine showed us what happens when someone refuses to tire. She showed us that strength isn't found in shouting the truth louder. It's found in never whispering it, even when it costs you everything. Her punishment wasn't just about her words. It was about her presence, her unwillingness to fit the mold, her refusal to bow, her insistence that you don't need a robe to speak the law if you know what justice is supposed to sound like. And in that truth, she offered us the deepest human lesson of all, that the law doesn't work until we demand it to. She reminded us that the people most likely to be punished in silence are the same people least likely to be believed. That fairness cannot survive without witnesses. That silence doesn't equal peace. It often hides suffering. That bureaucracy doesn't bleed, but it kills. Quietly, legally, repeatedly. She reminded us that systems don't feel shame. People do. And so it's people who must speak, people who must resist. Not because it's easy, but because when the law forgets its purpose, we become the last line between power and the powerless. She reminded us that losing a title doesn't mean losing your impact, that being disbarred doesn't mean being defeated, that you can be locked out of courtrooms and still be heard by the world. Because the voice they tried to silence is now amplified through the people she refused to abandon. The boy expelled without cause, the woman fined into homelessness, the father whose name was erased in court files because someone clicked the wrong box. These weren't stories to Jasmine. They were warnings. They were the country's conscience on mute. And so she became the volume button. She showed us that justice isn't just a verdict. It's a refusal to surrender. That advocacy is not about shouting into microphones. It's about staying in the room when everyone else is pretending nothing happened. She didn't demand a movement. She inspired one. Not because she called it to life, but because she made silence impossible. And what that taught us, what no courtroom transcript could fully capture, is this. If you are waiting for someone else to give you justice, you will wait until you are buried beneath the paper trail of your own disappearance. Jasmine taught us that you don't need permission to fight back. You need clarity. You don't need to be appointed. You need to be awake. That sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply refuse to shut up. She taught us that the law is not sacred if it forgets the people it was written for. That power must be held accountable, not just by ballots, but by bravery. And that the most dangerous person in a corrupt system is someone with nothing left to lose but her truth. So if you're still asking what the lesson is, if you're still wondering why this story matters, it's this. Jasmine Crockett lost her law license, but she gained something far greater, a nation's eyes, a generation's spine, and a legacy that reminds us all, justice does not begin at the bench. It begins when someone stands up and refuses to sit back down. And that is exactly what she did. And if Jasmine Crockett's journey taught us anything, it's this. Reform doesn't come from watching, it comes from moving. A legacy written in blood, paper, and silence is not meant to sit on a bookshelf or trend for a weekend. It's meant to challenge you, to call you out, to ask the only question that matters after injustice has been revealed. What will you do now? Because Jasmine never asked to become a symbol. She never asked to stand alone against the highest court in the nation. But when they stripped her of her title, tried to erase her voice, and cast her into political exile, she did something that terrified them more than any courtroom speech. She kept going. She built an army out of broken rules. She turned denial into documentation. She showed the world that power doesn't end with a robe or a gavel. It ends when people stop believing it's untouchable. And now the truth is out. The receipts have been read. The curtain has been pulled back. But the machine hasn't stopped. The faces change. The scandals rotate. The headlines move on. And that's how it survives, because we let it. So the story can't stop here. Not with her last words. Not with the Senate summons. Not with a legacy framed in courage. Because if it does, the system wins again. Not by silencing her, but by convincing us that watching her was enough. It's not. If you've ever read a headline and felt your throat tighten, your chest burn, your fist clench, don't let that pass. Let it transform. Anger is not a weakness, it's a beginning. It's the heat that forges action. And Jasmine's story is not a monument, it's a match. What it ignites is up to you. Start where you are. You don't need a law degree. You don't need permission. You need awareness and the courage to face the systems that count on your silence. Look at your community. Who's being fined for speaking up? Who's losing their job over invisible rules? Who's being profiled, passed over, priced out, pushed away? Ask hard questions in easy places. Go to school board meetings. Demand transparency from local courts. Sit in housing tribunals. Watch eviction hearings. Read administrative rulings that no one ever explains. You'll see the same pattern Jasmine exposed. Procedural cruelty wrapped in polite language. And when you see it, say something. Record it. Write it. Amplify it. Power only thrives when people stop paying attention. And the system counts on your exhaustion more than your approval. It knows you'll get angry. It knows you'll talk. But it bets you won't act. That you'll fall asleep before the paperwork is signed. That you'll scroll away while someone else's future is quietly erased in a courtroom without cameras. Don't. You want to honor Jasmine's story? Don't repeat it. Prevent it. That means building systems that work for people who don't look like power. That means protecting whistleblowers, funding legal clinics, rewriting policies that were designed to confuse the poor while protecting the wealthy. It means standing up for people whose names you'll never know, because the principle matters more than the spotlight. And if you're already inside the system, if you're a clerk, a staffer, a lawyer, a judge, you have even more responsibility. You know where the shadows are. You know which rules are abused and which are ignored. Speak, leak, dissent. Not because it's safe, but because it's right. Jasmine wasn't saved by her status. She was betrayed by it, and she didn't survive by obeying the system. She survived by breaking its silence. This is your moment now, because while the courtroom has emptied, the fight has only grown louder. Across the country, thousands of cases like Jasmine's are already underway. Quiet rulings, sealed files, fines handed out like weapons. The people being crushed aren't famous. They don't have platforms. They only have the truth. And they need someone to believe it. Be that person. Volunteer at your local legal aid center. Demand FOIA releases from your city hall. Start a coalition. Help translate legal forms for communities the system intentionally leaves behind. Teach people their rights. Teach kids how to ask questions that make adults uncomfortable. Because that discomfort, that's how empires fall. Jasmine didn't become a threat because she shouted. She became a threat because she knew where to look. And when she looked, she documented everything. That's what made her dangerous. Not her charisma, not her politics, her proof. So build proof. Build stories. Build resistance with files and photos and affidavits and timelines. Show that injustice isn't theoretical, it's traceable, it's survivable, and with enough witnesses, it's beatable. Don't get distracted by the noise. The system will throw you scandals, spectacles, and false saviors. It will beg you to focus on the chaos while the structure stays the same. Jasmine knew better. She didn't chase villains. She exposed the script. And when she tore it apart, she handed the pen to us. So now it's your turn to write the next scene. Not a speech, a movement, not a tweet, a demand, not a moment of silence, a lifetime of disruption. Because if Jasmine stood in front of the most powerful judge in America and said, "You cannot silence me," then we owe it to her and to every person without a microphone to keep echoing that truth until it breaks through every locked door. Be loud, be precise, be relentless. Because justice doesn't arrive in marble courtrooms. It arrives when people like you refuse to leave until it does. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.